Kia ora tātou, ko Jeremy toku ingoa, excuse me. No whanganui ahau, he kai wāwahi mātua taku tūranga mahi. Excuse me if that was a really crap mihi. I'm in my second semester of Māori night classes at Unitec and I'm just trying to use it. And I had to look up yesterday the title for editor, and kai wāwahi mātua, if I've got that right, felt kind of impressive, so I wanted to use it. Anyway, thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Khan, for inviting me. I have to admit, when Khan told me the title, the theme of today's talk, I wilted a little because I can't lay claim to being a genius, of course, and so you've all turned up to hear me talk about something I don't really know anything about. So I thought the best place was to start with clear evidence, not fake humility, but clear evidence that I'm not a genius. I've got one anecdote, and I think it's highly conclusive, and it's got some pictures to go with it. Oops. So in 1986, I was boarding rather miserably at the incredibly gay-friendly Napier Boys High School. I wasn't officially gay because the consequences of that are still too insane to contemplate. That is me in the second row, almost in the middle, with the very impressive Ginger Buffont. Although I was not a genius at cricket, I was good enough to be picked for a team from the school that would travel to the UK for a cricket tour 2 years after we were chosen, so in my final year at school. So this is an example of me not being a genius. My parents didn't have any money, so I spent 2 years doing the most shit jobs imaginable and my weekends and holidays to save up for the so-called, by the Daily Telegraph, cricket trip of a lifetime. Like really shit jobs that I was really bad at. Grubbing thistles for grumpy farmers, docking lambs for grumpy farmers, trapping and skinning possums and selling their skins. I was part of the fur trade. And then finally, at the age of 17, I got to take my first ride in a plane ever. This was after the plane. And go all the way to the UK, only to find that we spent most of the 3 weeks we were away travelling around the country in these terrible camper vans, playing way too much cricket. I think we had 20 days away and 11 days of those were playing cricket. And the greatest tragedy, we got to spend 4 hours in London, which almost broke my heart. Imagine saving up for 2 years, skinning possums, and then getting to spend 4 hours in London. Geniuses would not do that. Plus, another slightly lack of genius anecdote, a genius wouldn't still be allowing his mother to cut his hair when he was 17. Mum didn't actually know how to cut hair, which I think you can see in this photo. So, not a genius. Khan actually said that today's theme didn't matter and that I could just talk about myself. But by then it was too late because I'd started thinking about the notion of genius, and it was really interesting trying to unpick that and to try and think about the qualities of genius of geniuses that non-geniuses like myself could try and emulate. So I talked about this with my husband and a couple of friends when we went on a drive to Lake Tarawera last weekend. And we came up with these points. I hope you can read them, but I'll read them out. We decided that geniuses probably don't have clearly defined goals or do 5-year plans because they're really boring. We decided that geniuses are probably comfortable with stumbling around in the dark a bit. We were interested in this idea of being comfortable with intellectual discomfort and of embracing uncertainty and of being really happy to admit that there's a lot that you will never know and that you don't know. Another friend I asked about this said geniuses were good at saying no to things. He's a really busy guy. And they had a talent for filtering out extraneous crap and focusing on what mattered. And so that's where I found a way to force my way into the genius narrative, because I edit Paperboy, which for those of you who don't know is a free weekly magazine that we started in November. And I see my job every day as just trying to kind of filter out extraneous crap and use the magazine to tell a whole lot of compelling stories about the city we're living in. So a little bit more about me. I trained as a journalist. Paperboy is probably the best job I've ever had. I grew up without a TV because my parents thought we'd read more if we didn't have one. So here's a picture of, oh sorry, that's the Paperboy slide. I'll talk more about that later. This is a picture of me in the front and my brother in the back making our own fun in cardboard boxes without a television. We don't look like we're having very much fun, but neither do kids that are watching TV, right? My dad, before he retired, was a primary school teacher in a little country school called Kereru, mostly. He worked there for 30 years. And that school had about 30 pupils and is out in the Wops, sort of west of Hastings. my parents subscribed to The Listener. And when you live in the country and you don't have a television and the internet hasn't been invented yet, the arrival of The Listener and your letterbox every week is kind of a big deal. So I spent a lot of my childhood, playing Lego and other stuff, but also lolling around on the floor, reading this magazine. And I think it's kind of one of the first glimmers of journalism in my life, I suppose, and getting addicted to that weekly cycle, which I've strangely found myself in now. I also spent a lot of time reading my parents' Time Life anthology. They had a lot of books, not a lot of money, but a lot of books. And the Life anthology is really interesting because it's kind of full of wildly eclectic imagery that all got seared into my childhood brain, like Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald, the moment at which he was shot, and starving prisoners in Nazi death camps, and a mob of deranged Beatles fans trying to get to the band. And that was all mixed up with pictures of celebrities like Marilyn Monroe and Jane Fonda, so it was this kind of crazy mixture, but something I found really compelling. It was kind of journalism as a record of history in a sense, and a kind of attempt to make sense of the times we're living in and the cultures we're living in. This was another favourite book from my childhood. Before my dad met my mum, he was travelling in Canada, and he went to the 1967 Expo in Montreal and brought back this book with him, which I used to read a lot, and I was kind of really intrigued by this sort of super utopian notion of a world not untethered from history, but kind of the ability to start with a clean slate. All these incredible architects and designers from all over the world coming together for, I think it was a 3-month period, to create this utopian village. And I was especially taken with Moshe Safdie's Habitat, which was built and completed in time for the 67 Expo, which I think is still one of the most remarkable medium density housing programs in the world. Unfortunately, it was kind of too groundbreaking and therefore too expensive and not replicable. But it's still such a beautiful creation. I've never been to Montreal, but I really want to go and see it. Sorry, where was I? Oh yeah, my dad also dabbled in journalism a bit when I was a kid. When I was younger, we lived in a place called Ardkeen, and Dad was teaching at the school there. That was kind of west of Wairoa, and that only had 12 pupils, including me and my brother, and Dad was the single teacher. But in his free time, he did a couple of stories for the Wairoa Star, and I just have kind of fuzzy memories of feeling a sense of pride when we saw his byline in the little Wairoa Star newspaper when it arrived. So, as I mentioned, I went to Napier Boys High School, where we were fed grotesque things like curried eggs for lunch. And I got hassled for most things, and that included being a geeky subscriber to Time magazine as a teenager. And again, this kind of theme of wild eclecticism comes through, where you have, the Challenger explosion on a cover, and then you have Madonna on another, and Sade and Naomi Campbell and Deng Xiaoping, and a collage by Robert Rauschenberg. I like what I guess we'd now call this kind of mix of high and low culture. I don't see culture as necessarily high and low, but I liked magazines like this and how they could kind of mix art and television together, or current events and politics with popular music, and not have to apologise for any of that. I think today we expect people to be quite stratified in their tastes, but I think all of us are kind of eclectic in the material we want to read. We want trash and we want intelligent stuff, and we don't want to be patronised about any of that. Further evidence of not being a genius, I went to the University of Otago, where foolishly I tried to get into medical school. I think the reason I tried to do this was I went to see the careers counsellor at school in 7th form, and he said, you've got quite good marks. My best subject was English, so why medicine came up, I don't really know. But I think at that age you're quite sort of susceptible to flattery, and he said, well, you've kind of got 3 choices. You could be a lawyer, or you could be a doctor, or he's like, you could be a teacher. And I was like, oh, okay, sure. And the weird thing is I said, oh, okay, well, I might be a doctor, because, I'll go to med school and that'll be amazing. My grandma's a nurse, it's all in the family, it's fantastic. And then when you're 17 and you tell people that you're going to go to medical school, the positive reinforcement is amazing. It's like, oh, that's incredible, what a great kid, you're phenomenal. And so I went to Otago and I got an E for chemistry in one paper and another E for the other chemistry paper. I tried really hard too. I went to every lecture in every laboratory and studied. And so I carried on, fortunately, and did a BA in English, which was fantastic, and kind of worked a little bit at the student radio station in the news team there, where we compiled news bulletins by rewriting stories out of the Otago Daily Times. which at the time felt really naughty, but now is basically what everybody does on the internet anyway. And then I came to Auckland to what was then called AIT, is now AUT, and I did a one-year journalism program. It's kind of a long story, so I won't tell it, but I worked at a radio station at the time, which was Alan Gibbs, the billionaire, who has the sculpture park up north and funds the ACT Party. I don't know if he still does that, but sorry, I will tell the story because it's quite fun. He decided to bring the BBC World Service to New Zealand on a local frequency, and so he arranged the rights to do that, bought the frequency, and then set Lindsay Perigo up on a local morning show from I think it was from 7 till 9. And when I was still at Tech, I got this job as Lindsay's producer, which basically meant making coffee in the mornings and editing interviews he'd done. And editing interviews in those days was literally the reels of tape with a razor blade, cutting out the bit you wanted to cut out and then sellotaping the pieces of tape together. And kind of listening, because Lindsay had a stomach ulcer and drank way too much coffee. He'd drink the whole filter pot by the time he went on air, and sometimes that would aggravate his ulcer, so I'd sort of hear him vomiting blood in the kitchenette sink, and then he'd get on air and go, "Good morning, this is Lindsay Perigo," which was pretty fantastic. Anyway, some of the other staff that were there were Deborah Coddington, Alan Gibbs used to drop in, Rodney Hyde was kind of one of the chief guys behind the station. It was a kind of libertarian nuthouse, and Lindsay was incredibly charming and always used to say to me things like, "Don't worry, Jeremy, eventually we'll knock that university liberalism out of you." Which they kind of failed to do, but it was kind of really interesting to be immersed in that environment, which was really feverish at the time. Everybody that ever came into the station seemed to say that, the changes that the 1984 Labour government implemented had to happen, and now we need to double down on those changes and all that kind of stuff. And I guess in a sense I had grown up in a liberal bubble and not been challenged on those ideas, so it was quite good to be challenged on them. I have to say at the time I didn't have any articulate ideas to go up against these kind of three highly intelligent, smart libertarians, but it was a kind of good way to take myself out of the way I was used to thinking and examine things from another side. I escaped the mad libertarian environment and got a job as a staff writer at Metro magazine, which was in the days when Metro had 6 staff writers. What were you saying? These are my 3 Metro cover stories that I did in my time there. I actually was throwing up Suzanne Paul's train in the background of that shoot as well, so the wind caught it. That was a great moment. Metro had 6 staff writers then, and a deputy editor, 3 designers. It was so kind of tooled up with staff. It's incredible to think of that now because very few media organizations, you're basically talking New York Times level of staffing right there. But we also didn't have Google and we didn't have email, so we kind of reported in a really different way. We had to just phone people and then go and meet them and interview them. But we would have a month to write, a 4,000 word story, which was incredibly luxurious, and also great people like Warwick Roger and Nicola Leggett were there to kind of just patiently tutor us, and we had so much time for them to school us in the value of journalism and the value of writing that was a kind of great immersion and a great experience. After I'd been at Metro for 3 years, my boyfriend at the time got a job in Hong Kong, so I moved there with him and lived there for 5 years and worked as a journalist. I was the Hong Kong correspondent for Variety, which was fantastic, which is still going, but it kind of at the time was the Hollywood entertainment industry sort of Bible. And so I got to interview Michelle Yeoh, but it wasn't all celebby. It was quite interesting because it was quite business-oriented. So I was writing a lot about the Hong Kong film business, which was kind of super popular, but only in a sort of pirated sense then, so nobody was making any money, and probably still aren't. I also worked at a free weekly magazine called HK, which I'd completely forgotten I'd done. I was there for 2 years as the associate editor. And it wasn't until we were kind of about to launch Paperboy, I was like, oh, I've done this before. Which was a relief. Was when somebody kept writing in after we'd launched actually and said, you need to be more like HK magazine. And I thought, oh shit, yeah, good. And then I worked at a magazine. HK sadly is now closed, and so is this magazine that I worked at in Hong Kong called Asia Week, which made me think that basically working in the media these days, it's, you think you kind of, I grew up in an era where you think you kind of choose a profession and then you kind of stick to it and it's all nice and then you retire. But working in the media these days, if this gift works, is essentially this. Indiana Jones, if you can see it, with the huge And it's this is the Star Wars mashup one, so that represents technology bearing down on the media. So yeah, it's an industry in which we've had to you have to duck and dive a lot now in the media just to kind of remain employed, and as a lot of industries are being completely reshaped by the internet. It's kind of been really fascinating in some senses, but in other senses you just think good things stay stable for a while. Anyway, I returned to New Zealand. I worked as a producer at Morning Report for a couple of years, living in Wellington. This is Jeff Robinson and Sean Plunkett with our producer Martin Gibson. That was fantastic. It was such a great job because RNZ's full of incredibly dedicated people who are so knowledgeable and professional and generally don't have bad attitudes, because you just have to put out these programs on time. But the shifts really got to me in the end, because we would work on this rotation where one week you'd start at 3 p.m. and work till 11 or usually midnight or 2 a.m. Setting up the show. The next week you'd start at 11 p.m. and do the overnight stuff with the international stories, and then the next week you'd start at 5 a.m. and kind of put the show to air. So it was perpetual jet lag, no social life, but a really nice place to work other than that. Then I was lured briefly to television, to an art show that existed on Sunday night in the graveyard slot for about 3 years in the end, called Front Seat. It was on at 10:30 on a Sunday. Oliver Driver presented it, and I was looking on Google for images of it, and I remembered this interview I'd done with the lovely late art dealer Peter McLeavy, where we arranged him nicely in front of one of Peter Robinson's very phallic artworks, which Peter was totally into. Then after television, and this was a long job, I got the job editing Home magazine, which I did for 11 years. Home is also published by Bauer, which publishes Paperboy. I've always been really interested in architecture and the way we construct not only our living environments at home, but cities in general. The Expo thing that I showed you before attests to that. And when I started at Home, it was called Home and Entertaining Magazine, and the company had kind of grafted what was Home and Building then, which was kind of an industry publication for architects that had been around since the 1930s. And they'd had this publication called FQ Entertaining, which has kind of come back a few times since then, but they decided to shut FQ Entertaining, and they just sort of slammed the two things together. So I inherited this kind of quite good architecture magazine that then suddenly dived into 20 pages of Julie Biusso's recipes, which felt kind of in some ways in the late 90s it was really in tune with the times, but by the time I started in 2005 it felt pretty dated. And so I sort of nagged in my passive-aggressive way for a couple of years, and then finally convinced my bosses to change the name just to Home and to kind of tighten its focus so it was just focused on architecture and design. And while I was there, I kind of tried to make it a bit of a mission to focus on, or to preach, I suppose, in some ways, the virtues of investing in good design, not only in your home environment, but in cities, of building once and building well, of not wasting resources, of fighting against this kind of stupid real estate shit where, couples I knew were building 4-bedroom houses for resale reasons when they never needed all that space, presuming that everybody in Auckland also needed a 4-bedroom home and that there weren't couples like them that were also in the real estate market. Also doing things cheaply, which meant that everybody would rip out their kitchens in 5 years' time and chuck all that stuff in the tip. We also did kind of a focus on small homes to just educate people that if they invested in design, they wouldn't need as much space as they needed. But after 11 years, I was still really loving the job, but I kind of started to feel that I was less interested in standalone houses, although we did kind of a few medium density projects in the magazine, but I was more interested in the way cities were made, and that was the kind of justification I used to carry myself over to Paperboy. We started on this about 3 years ago, and my boss at Home said, "Can you come to this meeting?" And there were kind of just 5 of us there, and he said, "We've got this secret project coming on." And they, at work, it's hilarious, they like to have code names for projects that are secret, and so this was Project Disrupt, because it was going to disrupt the market. And so there was this kind of fake, hilarious James Bondness about it from the beginning. But our chief executive had the idea that it was kind of time for a free publication in Auckland, that this could be kind of a good business model. It wasn't just wishful thinking, because in London, the most buoyant section of the print market is freebies given away on the underground. I think 7 of the top 10 revenue generating titles in London are free on the Underground. And we felt that commuter numbers had grown in Auckland sufficiently to allow that. But more importantly, we felt that Auckland was at this really interesting point in its history. And, you know, I'd lived in Auckland twice. I'd spent a lot of time here with my cousins as a kid, hanging out in Manurewa and coming into town and thinking it was amazing. But when I first lived in Auckland in the 90s, it was the kind of place where if somebody came to visit from overseas, you sort of wanted to whisk them away to Queenstown because it didn't feel like a proper city. People tended to bag it. There wasn't a lot of pride about it, and it felt by 2000 and when was it 3 years ago? We were talking 2014 when we were talking about it, that there'd been this huge change in the city. It wasn't just growing, but it was there was a sense of pride about its unique identity, and that it was becoming a world city. And I don't mean that in a generic way, but a world city, and that it's one of those cities that you'd kind of recommend for people to visit because it had special qualities about it. And so that, backed up by our research team, then did a big research project to see if those attitudes were kind of felt more widely, and it seemed that they were. So we decided to take the punt and launch this, not without a lot of toing and froing and knockbacks. We had a really long time to work on this because our Australian parent company said no a couple of times, and we just sort of went away and tinkered with the model. Initially, the idea was that it would be repurposing content from within Bauer Media. Now, Bauer publishes heaps of magazines, The Listener, North and South, Metro, Fashion Quarterly, Taste, Your Home and Garden, Home, blah, blah, blah. Lots. So it was this idea that we'd kind of take content from those other things and repurpose it and kind of put it out in the market and be sort of super cheap and slightly tricky. And then we never had kind of a formal conversation about ditching that strategy, but it just became apparent that was kind of, we realised that, well, I was arguing that from the beginning, but I just sort of said, readers are smart. And they read widely, and all this content is kind of available online in a lot of cases. They're not going to go for a publication that's just kind of leftovers, reheated. And I had kind of an incredible amount of freedom in a way doing this. And when I look back and I think about the level of freedom I was given, it's kind of bizarre because, this is a big commercial organisation. I was presenting things in every meeting to 6, 7 layers of, not layers of management, but bosses who could have all vetoed it at any point. But there was never a point where any suggestion that I made got knocked back. So just a couple of examples. I said that we would build the magazine on these 4 key content pillars: food, style, culture, and urbanism. And someone at this meeting where I said this said, "What's urbanism?" And I said, it's the way it's what the city's becoming. It's cycle lanes, it's good architecture in the city, it's medium density housing, it's all those kinds of things. And they immediately said, "Oh yeah, that's great. You should give that more pages than you're planning to." And I also said, this can't be a magazine just for what is often talked about at work as this desirable demographic, which basically translates as pretty well off, white, lives in this narrow band of the city, kind of in the isthmus, but not even as wide as that really. And I said it has to be a magazine about all of Auckland, because even people that are living in those areas want to know about the wider city that they're living in. So it has to feel inclusive and reflect Auckland's multiculturalism. And they said, okay, great, that's fine. And in the first issue we did, which was heavily scrutinised at work, we had a photo essay, which I should have included in here actually, but forgot to, by Edith Amatuanai, which was a beautiful series of photographs she'd taken. She lives in Ranui, and she'd just taken photos of kids hanging out on the streets. Beautiful photographs, and she had a great narrative about how her photographs make those kids feel seen, even if only for a moment, because often a lot of those kids don't feel that way. And I kind of presented this last at this meeting where I was kind of like, here's all these kids in West Auckland who are not your target demographic, but should be. And, what do you think? 6 pages, big pictures, and everybody went quiet. The chief executive sort of leafed through it, and then he just looked up and said, "Fucking brilliant." He's quite Australian in his approach. He's not Australian, but he's a man of few words. And so he said that, and so that's a kind of example of the liberty that I had, which was extraordinary. We decided there were things we didn't want to do. We didn't want to define ourselves in opposition to other titles necessarily, but there were places we didn't want to go. So we decided the media was already full of reckons, and we weren't going to be a mag full of more of them. Reckons are kind of a cheap way of producing content. They're all over the internet. I like reading them as much as the next person, but we didn't feel there was a whole lot of value in getting a whole lot of columnists kind of shouting. I also believe that most people only have probably 4 good columns in them until they start repeating themselves. And that's why columnists and columnists online get shouty, I think, because they're repeating themselves and they have to amp things up to get attention and make them feel like they're covering new ground. We also wanted to step outside the kind of all-pervasive influence of PR, because as media resources have been trimmed, it means that newsrooms have got fewer staff, so it means that when PR companies serve you a story on a plate and say, this person's available for an interview at this time and we have photographs that you don't have to pay for that you can use, you tend to go for that. So we were determined to resist that and to not feature the same 50 Aucklanders that you see in the media all the time. We were also really conscious, as we were developing the mag, Auckland's unitary plan was out for consultation, and crazed NIMBYs and St Heliers and Milford were screaming about the possibility of a Hobson Street tower being built next door to their beautiful villa. And others, looking at you, Mike Hosking, not here, were just saying stupid shit about how Aucklanders love their cars and didn't want to get out of them, and that bus lanes were stopping those cars from getting to work, and who wanted to live in apartments anyway, all that kind of stuff. And other people, looking at Bill English in particular, were saying that Auckland needed to get a bit ugly if it was going to have enough places for people to live. So we just decided that we didn't want to have those discussions. We didn't want to even make a magazine for people who thought those things, because they already had enough media to keep them perpetually wound up. So I was also just really tired of reading that crap. I couldn't stand it. So we decided that we wouldn't relitigate arguments over density or cycling or public transport, but we'd give our readers the dignity of presuming they were interested in a progressive, multimodal, egalitarian, multicultural, well-designed city. So that was one of our key kind of points. Now, although most of our content's available online, we also realised that web browsing is kind of this potentially infinite experience, and that there was great value in kind of a print product that was finite and thoughtful and carefully edited, and we paid good writers reasonable rates for good content and good photographers, that people would feel there was a value in that. It's just kind of, this is enough. This is what you need to know about the city kind of this week. And if you have this, it's okay. And it's almost like a digital detox in a sense. So we thought there was an advantage there too. We decided to be optimistic deliberately, but we also decided that we didn't want to ignore Auckland's problems, because let's face it, there are a lot. Housing is chief among them. And we've tried to work out, and we're still working out ways to tell stories about housing that don't make people feel like the whole situation's a complete train wreck and that there's nothing they can do. We don't want people to feel disempowered, but we want people to feel empathy for those that don't have homes, empathy for people who are in terrible renting situations and it's not their fault, and also to feel empowered to do something about it, whether that's volunteering for the City Mission. We did a big thing about the City Mission's distribution centre and how they need volunteers and also donations. We did a special issue on homelessness where Frances Walsh did a really beautiful story where she went to the Central Library, where the wonderful librarians there host a morning tea and a film screening for homeless people there every Monday. And homelessness, I think, just as a slight sideline, it's kind of often portrayed in the media as this total train wreck. It's kind of train wreck people who have ended up being more train wrecked because they don't have a roof over their heads. And the lovely thing about Frances's story was that she went along to these screenings, and of course she talked to those people about the fact that they didn't have a roof over their heads and the difficulties of that, but she also talked to them about movies which they were going to watch and what their favourites were. And some of them were incredibly erudite about art films, and some of them loved westerns, and some of them loved action movies, and it was just this kind of humane portrait that was quite different to the photo of somebody sitting on a mattress and asking for money as you walk past them. So that's been part of our approach too, and I have to say we're still learning that, but we're just trying to make people feel that they kind of have a stake in the city and that they can act in ways that can make a difference. I wanted to get back to learning from Genius, because that weekend, last weekend, when we went to Lake Tarawera, we were sitting in the car and we did a game of word association, and these were my responses: genius, Einstein; genius, Frank Lloyd Wright. I was like, oh shit, white, male, individual people. It was quite interesting. And we talked a lot about how I'm not presuming this is the case for all of you, but for me, my immediate responses to genius were racist and gendered. And we talked about genius being kind of slippery. It's not a fixed concept. And those geniuses, Einstein and Frank Lloyd Wright, are kind of geniuses in the rear view mirror. But at the time, they were also Frank Lloyd Wright was definitely an asshole. And they both had moments where they weren't geniuses. And I thought about contemporary artists and musicians and writers, and we sometimes allow them to be geniuses if they create a work that we think fits that definition, but then we cast them out of that club if the follow-up album doesn't match the promise of the first one. So nobody really gets to be a genius for a life unless they're kind of dead or truly extreme. And now I'm not saying also that Paperboy is genius, but relating to that discussion I was talking about, when we were talking in the car, we decided it was probably a good idea to move away from this notion of individual genius. And this wasn't part of our editorial strategy, but genius certainly wasn't part of the discussion. But we did decide to move away from this idea of having a kind of single definitive editorial voice, one that delivers thundering restaurant reviews saying this place is shit, you should never go. Because that's just one person's opinion, or editorials from me telling people what to think. Again, by week 5, I would have had nothing to say, according to my own rules around editorials. So there's no actual editorial in the magazine by me, there's no photograph of me. We wanted it to be a magazine that felt like it had many voices from all over the city in it. You can judge whether or not we're succeeding at that or not, but you could say at Paperboy that we wanted to believe, and we still want to believe, in the collective genius of the city. As I said, we encourage people to submit on local issues that matter to them, to email council, to participate, to volunteer and to have their say. And we hope that the information we share in the magazine makes people feel motivated and empowered to do that they feel like they love their city and they feel like they have a stake in it and they feel like they can make it a better place than it already is. And so we hope that we can help Auckland celebrate its unique identity, and that by creating this magazine every week, we can all work towards making the city a better place for everyone to live. Thank you.